when you get periods of where people are told to expect that they're going to be better off, and they see stagnation, and they're told that £1,000 over the course of 5 years is an improvement, etc. If this doesn't ring true, then they will think, but they're not just fed up with Labour, but we don't trust the Tories because the Tories made this mess. So maybe it's time to look for a radical party.
This is The Times at 1 with Andrew Neil, and you've been listening to the Chancellor's spring statement, the government's latest review of economic policy and where the economy was going. It was a highly partisan speech for a Chancellor at these big occasions, so this wasn't as big an occasion by any means as the budget. We didn't learn that much new, and we still don't know yet. We're just beginning to find out what the latest forecasts for the economy are from the Office of Budget Responsibility. But let me just give you some headlines on what the Chancellor said. She said inflation is coming down, which is true, though it's still higher than when she became Chancellor in July 2024. Borrowing is coming down, and it is in the years ahead. And she also said that interest rates are coming down. We've had 6 cuts so far. All of the forecasts in this spring statement and in the OBR were computed before, of course, events in the Gulf kicked off, and they could well have an impact on things like inflation and interest rates. She said that real wages were now rising more quickly in 18 months than they had done under 10 years under the Tories. But she did say that the prediction for growth this year, 2026, had been reduced by the OBR from 1.4%, it said in November, now to just 1.1%. And remember, that November forecast itself was a reduction, I think, from 1.9% was supposed to be this year. So it's almost 50% of what we thought it would be about a year ago. Other things we learned was that unemployment, which has been rising, she said would peak by late 2026, then start to fall. As I say, she said borrowing would be reduced. The cost of borrowing had come down, though that may now be under some pressure given what is happening in the Gulf and the impact that will have on interest rates. So we're now working through the OBR report to get more of these forecasts, because we didn't get that many from the Chancellor. As I say, it was a pretty partisan speech, and she was quite aggressive, quite strident in defence of what she thinks is the right economic policy. She also boasted about the biggest uplift in defence spending since the Cold War, which I would suggest is a figure that deserves a lot of scrutiny. Let's speak now to Times columnist Fraser Nelson and see if we can dig a little bit into this financial statement. Fraser, what is your... We'll get into some details in a minute, but what's your main takeaway from the OBR forecast and the Chancellor's speech?
Well, first of all, we haven't actually had the OBR forecast. Normally, they're instantaneously published on its website. It now seems the Treasury is taking control of that, and the Treasury doesn't seem to be much of a rush to actually give us these figures, perhaps because it knows that the OBR slap a giant asterisk on almost every statement she makes. Like, for example, she says the question is, will people feel better off by the end of this parliament? She was saying that's her exam question. Now, we know from the existing forecasts that disposable income is expected to grow by just 0.25% for this parliament. That's like a quarter of the normal rate they've grown. That is absolutely dismal. And the other thing, GDP per capita growth of 5.6%, you're saying over a parliament. Again, historically, this is not the highest in the G7, which she once promised us. So I imagine that when we do get these figures, they're going to show things in a very different light.
Before we came on air, I was told that the OBR forecasts would be published at 12:50, which is now, I think, almost 15 minutes ago. And we've seen no sign of them yet, Fraser.
Well, it's interesting. I went on the OBR website looking first, and they were saying other forecasts will be released throughout the course of the day. Now, this is very unusual because normally they're all released exactly when she sits down, almost literally the same minute that she sits down. If this is now a course of a day, this suggests some potential spin management where they're, wanting journalists to write up what she says before actually seeing the figures. Now, I hope that's just me being cynical, and as we speak, the full forecasts are there. But it becomes pretty difficult to spin nowadays because right now, ultimately, this wasn't a government elected on one word, growth. That was the manifesto. Not just growth, but the highest sustained growth in the G7, higher than America's. Now, we're seeing America, where I am right now, spinning ahead of the UK in growth terms. And also we're seeing unemployment as well rise significantly. Now, the good news, of course, is that inflation is coming down faster than was expected. That's partly to do with the measures she took. But of course, inflation only started rising once she got in office in the first place. It went from 2% to 4%. Now it's coming back to 2% again. But that little triangular bump hadn't been expected the first time around. So she's doing the best she can. And of course, the biggest asterisk is the global crisis now underway, the Gulf in chaos, oil prices surging, and the potential of an inflationary shock. So we'll see how much that changes the picture.
And indeed, that could knock all the OBR forecasts and what the Chancellor had to say today for six. But we don't know that yet, and we'll have to wait and see how long these spikes in oil and gas prices are. Let's just go into some of the main indicators. Inflation, of course, always very important. This government inherited inflation rate of 2%, which was pretty much on target in the summer of 2024. It then rose within a year to 4%, is back down to 3%. And from what I think she said, she's now expecting it to return to target. In other words, to return to what she inherited around sometime spring, early summer, 2%.
Yes, I know. And what we're seeing now is that it goes back to target later and later and later. And the cumulative effect on the cost of living is really quite damaging. And I remember when she came into office, it was supposed to be 2% and pretty much stay there. It wasn't really expected to bump again. And the other thing we've seen is the borrowing costs. Now, that is, by and large, the amount of faith that the outside world has in the UK economy. Our borrowing costs are now the highest out of any G7 country. That never used to be the case. And that's the case now. I imagine when the document comes out, we'll show that's going to be the real constraint she's facing, because she's paying so much more on debt interest now. She's paying so much more because her borrowing costs are a lot higher, and that's because of how precarious the national finances are borrowed. The word she used to describe her economic policy was securonomics. That was the word we heard before the election, not a word we heard now. But she had a pretty good theory last time around, that there will be shocks. And when these shocks come around, you need to make sure your debt is under control and your spending is under control so you can respond to the shocks. Now, for a lot of reasons not of her making, we are entering this new period of global uncertainty, already borrowing right up against the limits of what the markets will allow us. So there isn't really that much room for manoeuvre.
Right, so she can bank inflation is now going in the right direction after it rising when she went to the Treasury. So that's a plus and could help living standards if it's going to get down to target 2%. But you mentioned earlier, of course, that the one word this government got elected on was growth. It was going to improve growth. And we haven't seen the forecast yet. We don't know the full picture. But it seems to me the big story from the information we currently have this lunchtime is this downgrading of growth again for 2026 for this year to 1.1%, which is less than the OBR forecast in November, a lot less than it forecast a year ago, and less than growth in 2025. 1.1%. Now, it goes up she says, or the OBR forecast, it goes up next year and the year after. But of course, in these forecasts, as we know, Fraser, there's always jam tomorrow. 1.1% is not a growth rate that comes anywhere near delivering what the government promised in the election campaign.
Well, that's right. Growth was really their target. And they had documents at one stage where the word growth was the cover of a document. That was the main pledge. Now, perhaps the big news today is that growth has been downgraded for this year. Now, she says the upgrades later will make up for that. Well, we haven't seen those upgrades. Even now, there's nothing on the Treasury website. This big document that was supposed to be promised has not emerged. But of course, the growth per capita, that's going to be one of the issues. We know that one of the successes of this government is controlling net immigration. Now, it was almost 900,000 under the Tories. The last look, it was just over 200,000. And already it's lower than the OBR expected it to be. So Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, has really slammed the brakes on the number of visas issued. And remember that immigration is the number one concern in the public. It's actually slightly ahead of the economy, which is quite something given the cost of living crisis. So Keir Starmer can claim credit for making more progress on reducing that migration than anybody thought he could. The problem is that's got a side effect, that immigrants by and large tend to work, generate tax, and so we're going to see a fiscal hit as the cost of the success of controlling immigration. Now, of course, you can debate just how much of a cost that is, adjust for it per capita, etc. But this just serves to create another fiscal headroom for him. But if I was a Labour MP in a reform-facing seat, I would be shouting rather loudly about the unexpected success in cutting net migration.
The OBR was assuming net migration, I think, of around 340,000, and which is a big fall compared to what it was. That was built into his growth forecast. Did I take it right that the Chancellor's now said these new growth forecasts, the OBR, has now taken into account a lower net migration figure, that in fact something not being widely reported is that net migration is falling quite deeply?
Oh, yes. I mean, net migration is down by something like 80%. It's probably the biggest single achievement of this government. Now, the Tories would say that's because of what they put in place before they left. But there's no doubt now that what they're heading towards is the lowest net migration figure we've seen for about 10 years. There's some forecasts suggesting that Britain might even hit net zero migration by the end of this year. Tom Calver at the Times has been reported on these kind of forecasts. Now, if this happens, that would mean that the Brexit tools are working more effectively than anybody expected, certainly anybody at the OBR. The OBR has got a dismal record on forecasting net migration. I think it recognises that and puts a big pinch of salt in even its own forecasts. But when the new figures come out, it will be quite interesting because they are expected to maybe not go back to the tens of thousands, but certainly go back to the lowest that they've been for many, many years and stand a big, big contrast with what's happened in the out-of-control last Conservative years.
So, relatively good news on inflation. She says borrowing is coming down too as a share of GDP. It seems to be coming down. It's going to be a little bit better in the financial year coming to an end than the OBR thought in November. It comes down a bit more in the next financial year too. So that's another one that she can bank as going in the right direction. Unemployment is a problem for this government, isn't it? It's already risen to 5.2%, which is about a full percentage point higher than it was when they came to power. Youth unemployment, as I understand it, Fraser, is now over 16%. And she's saying that it will not start to come down until the end of this year. She then says it will continue to fall for the rest of the decade. But again, we've always been, we're wary enough, having done enough of these forecasts, to be wary of the out years. The thing is that unemployment is due to stay high for the rest of this year.
Yes, this is one of the difficult points. Unemployment has been rising, and that's been a narrative of this government. But what she's saying today is that it's expected to peak at the end of the year and then fall again. Now, the Bank of England told us exactly the same in their forecasts a few weeks ago. But this contrasts with the overall aim of this government, which is to increase the employment to 80%. That was an ambitious goal. It looks like that goal is nowhere near being met. So we've got a tale of two sets of forecasts here. You know, the story versus what Rachel Reeves said before she was elected looks significantly worse on almost every single level, on employment, on growth, on borrowing, on tax. But when you compare it to versus how it looked about 6 months to 9 months ago, there are significant improvements on inflation. Now, employment has got worse, but at least she's saying that we're going to get over the hump on unemployment. This, of course, doesn't take in the number of people who are on sickness benefit, who weren't counted as being officially unemployed. That number is set to go up by a staggering figure, almost 500,000, which is the equivalent of losing the working age population of Birmingham over the course of a parliament. And
living standards. Living standards pretty much stagnated under the less Conservative government for quite a long time. And you mentioned earlier that some of the recent figuring from the OBR suggested it was hardly going to boom in this particular parliament. She's now saying, and she pledges that people will be better off by the end of this parliament than they were at the start of it. I think she said put a figure of £1,000 better off. I assume she means in real terms. Otherwise, we can't really say if they're better off or not. Is that credible? Can she do that? And even £1,000 over 5 years, better than it went before, but it's not great.
Well, I have to say, Andrew, that, you know, the idea that it's a plus if people are better off over the course of 5 years, I mean, throughout most of the economic history of this country, there's barely been a 5-year period. People haven't been better off over the end of it. Now, she was saying that she expects GDP per capita to be up 5.6% over the course of this parliament versus not a shrinkage over the last parliament. Now, that's a good rhetorical point. The last parliament, of course, contained COVID and lockdowns and a knock to 6. But I guess she will be able to point to the sort of success in her period that doesn't seem to have any crises versus the last one, which did. But the question is whether people feel better or not. Now, now the OBR figures, it's just landed as we've been speaking. I just had a glance at it meanwhile.
Right.
Now, and one of the figures I'm going to be looking for is what's the average salary expected to be by the end of this parliament? Because the last forecast, it was expected to be about £42,000, which, if you adjust for inflation, is lower than it was before the 2008 crash. In other words, that's not one lost decade, but 2 lost decades on salaries. Now, the thing is, the people of Britain are not used to this. We have not seen, absent some disaster like war, COVID, lockdown, such a long period of stagnation. And by the way, the Tory years were no better at all. This isn't a partisan point. But when you look at the opinion polls today, one of them has got Reform #1, then the Green Party #2, and Labour and Tories knocking it out for a 3rd place. Now, when you get periods of where people are told to expect that they're going to be better off, and they see stagnation, and they're told that £1,000 over the course of 5 years is an improvement, etc. If this doesn't ring true, then they will think, but they're not just fed up with Labour, but we don't trust the Tories because the Tories made this mess. So maybe it's time to look for a radical party. The big change in British politics is now there are 2 radical parties. We've got Reform and we've got the Greens as well. So we're now seeing British politics pizza sliced between left and right and, say, call it systemic versus anti-systemic parties. Now, each sort of quarter of this pizza has got a party, and we're now seeing the radical right and the radical left higher in polls. And if you want to try to work out why, then just look at the standards of living, look at the disposable income, look at the 2 lost decades of salaries, and there you can explain why there is so much dismay and so much willingness to try untested parties.
Final question, Fraser, just on the politics of her approach or her own personal approach. I mean, it was a very partisan speech. It wasn't the speech of a Chancellor who at times are a little bit above the fray. I thought her tone was aggressive, bordering on the strident. She talked in a way as if about her plan, how it was working and how the OBR forecasts were showing the plan was working, as if she was presiding over an economic miracle. The boom times were here and everything was tickety-boo. And then, of course, she was forced to reveal that growth will be barely 1% this year on the latest OBR forecast. Why do you think she took that tone? Is it a sign of panic? Is it a sign of worry that they're hemorrhaging votes? They've lost a lot to Reform. They're now losing even more to Green, and that she would try to overcome what is actually not a great economic story to tell by at least sounding confident, enthusiastic, aggressive?
Well, the thing is, she needs narrative of success. Every chancellor needs narrative of success. She's got fairly thin pickings right now. But the only response the government can give to its challengers, either the opposition or the insurgents of left and right, is that, look, our plan is working. We said we'd deliver for you, and we have done. And she's trying to find things there. Now, by the way, I've now got the OBR report here. This shows that taxes are about, as we knew, hitting a post-war record. And that half of the tax rises come from stealth taxes. That's the other thing. What she's not announcing is the thresholds aren't going up, and that's accounting for a lot of pain. People ultimately feel this pain, and there's a disconnect between the narrative of success, which every chancellor needs to give, and what they're feeling in their pocket. When that disconnect gets too big, then the opportunity for new parties grows. And we're seeing now that the other interesting thing is that the increase in share prices, according to the OBR, is responsible for most of the uplift in the public finances. So you're getting more capital gains tax, you're getting more of other such tax receipts. So, I'm about to dive into the document here, but it looks as if rather a lot of asterisks on all the positive things originally told us in that.
All right, Fraser, we'll let you get on with it. You've got a lot of digging to do, but I thank you for joining us here on The Times at 1. Fraser Nelson there.